Chapter 1: Whispers on the Wind. The scent of damp earth and pine clung to the air, a familiar perfume that did little to soothe the tremor in Celeste's hands. She kept her head down, her silver hair a curtain hiding her face from the other pack members. Invisibility was a skill she had perfected because for a Null wolf, to be seen was to be judged. A cold ache settled deep in her bones, a constant companion that had grown stronger with each passing moon. It was a weariness her grandmother had dismissed as sorrow, but it felt deeper, heavier. Like her very soul was getting tired. Tonight, though, was supposed to change everything. Her entire existence had been a long, quiet prayer for this single moment, the mating ceremony. The one night the moon goddess was said to right all wrongs, to grant the gift of a fated mate. For her, it was more than a gift. It was a cure. A chance to finally be whole, to feel the pack bond that was a phantom limb to her, an ache for a connection she could never grasp. Her mate, Ronan, was the alpha's son. Golden and strong, he was everything she wasn't. To be chosen by him, to be loved by him, to be anchored by him. That was the only dream she'd ever allowed herself to have. Did he feel the same pull she did? A fragile thread of destiny woven between their souls? Or was she just a duty he had to perform? Following that bitter thought, she risked a glance across the clearing. Ronan stood with his friends, his laughter loud and confident. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second, and his smile didn't just falter. It vanished, replaced by a tight, annoyed line. Her stomach twisted into a cold knot. He looked away as if the sight of her was a stain on the festive night. The hope that fluttered in her chest felt suddenly fragile, like a butterfly with paper wings. This feeling of dread intensified as the alpha called for the ceremony to begin. The pack gathered around the sacred altar, a flat, moon-bleached rock that had seen generations of matings. Celeste moved through the crowd, the whispers following her like rustling leaves. A Null. Poor Ronan. The line will be tainted. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, her worn-out dress feeling thin and foolish under the weight of their judgment. Her goal was simple: get to the altar, accept the bond, and finally belong. As she stepped into the clearing, the moonlight hit her, making her pale skin seem almost luminous. And that's when she saw him. He wasn't part of the pack. He stood near the edge of the trees, a man carved from shadow and stillness, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. He was an anomaly, a disruption to the ancient ritual. While everyone else watched her with pity or scorn, he watched her with an unnerving intensity. His eyes, even from this distance, felt like they could see right through her skin, past the hollow space where her wolf slept, and into the weary soul beneath. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a sharp, assessing focus that was somehow more terrifying than any insult. Who was he? His presence was an open loop in her mind, a question without an answer, because right now all that mattered was Ronan. She reached the altar, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and turned to face the golden wolf who held her entire future in his hands. Chapter 2. The altar of ash building on that feeling of intense scrutiny from the stranger, Celeste forced her attention back to Ronan. He walked toward her, his movements graceful and powerful, the perfect air. The pack held its breath. This was it, the culmination of her life's quiet desperation. She looked into his handsome face, searching for a flicker of affection, of recognition, of anything other than the cold duty she saw there. Her own hope felt so loud in the silence, a desperate scream in her chest. She just wanted this to be real. The alpha began the ritual words, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the soles of her feet. Tonight, the moon goddess blesses us. She reveals the paths that must be joined, the souls that must be bound. Ronan Blackwood, son of the alpha, do you stand before your fated mate? Ronan's eyes, a clear summer blue, met hers. For a moment, she let herself believe. because believing was all she had ever had. Then, he spoke. His voice wasn't a shout. It was worse. It was calm, clear, and carried across the clearing with chilling finality. I, Ronan Blackwood, son of Alpha Marcus, reject you, Celeste, as my fated mate. The words, like stones, each one a blow. Silence. A stunned, absolute stillness fell over the clearing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the moonlight turning harsh and cruel. Celeste's breath hitched in her throat, a choked, silent sob. She couldn't feel her hands, her feet. All she could feel was the hollow space inside her cracking wide open, a chasm of shame and black, empty despair. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a damnation. It was the universe screaming what she had always feared. You are nothing. You are broken. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and then the whispers started again. Not of pity this time, but of scornful, triumphant justification. Of course he did. She was never worthy. A Null can't be a Luna? The noise was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape, and they landed again on the man in the suit. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even flinched. While the rest of the world was a storm of motion and sound, he was an island of absolute calm. His dark eyes were still locked on her, his expression unreadable. Why wasn't he looking away? Didn't he see how pathetic she was? His stillness was an accusation of its own, and she couldn't bear it. As a result of this public humiliation, the Alpha stepped forward, his face grim. He couldn't meet her gaze. The rejection has been declared before the goddess, he announced, his voice booming with authority. Celeste, you no longer have a place in this pack. You are an outcast. You must be gone by sunrise. Gone. The word echoed in the shattered pieces of her heart. To be cast out was a death sentence. A lone wolf could not survive. She had no one, nothing. She had gambled her entire life on a single thread of hope, and Ronan had just set it on fire, leaving her with only the ashes. With the last of her strength, she turned away from the altar, away from the jeering faces, and walked toward the darkness of the forest, each step taking her further away from the only home she had ever known. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. Chapter 3. A King's Claim. The human city was a different kind of wilderness. It was a jungle of glass and steel, where the scents were sharp and alien, exhaust fumes, hot pavement, and the cloying sweetness of rot from a nearby alley. Celeste had found a job cleaning floors in a massive skyscraper, a place so tall it seemed to scratch the belly of the sky. She worked at night, a ghost in the empty halls, because the anonymity of the human world was the only sanctuary she had left. Here, she wasn't a Null or an outcast. She was just a girl no one saw, and that was almost a relief. The ache in her bones was worse now, a constant grinding pain that stole her sleep and her appetite. She was fading. She knew it. Consequently, she was too exhausted to notice the danger until it was too late. One night, as she pushed her cleaning cart onto an empty floor, a familiar, hated scent hit her. Pine and arrogance. Ronan. He wasn't alone. Two of his cronies from the pack were with him, their smirks wide and cruel in the dim emergency lighting. "Look what we have here," Ronan drawled, stepping in front of her cart, blocking her path. The little Null, playing human. Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you want, Ronan?" Her voice was a thin, reedy thing. "My father's been asking about you," he said, circling her like a predator. "He thinks it's a shame to let whatever you are go to waste. You could still be useful to the pack, as a servant." Panic clawed at her throat. To go back there, to serve the people who had celebrated her ruin? It was a fate worse than death. "No," she whispered. "Leave me alone." "I don't think so." He lunged, his hand grabbing her arm. His touch was like ice and fire, a shock of the bond that he had so carelessly thrown away. You belong to the pack. A sharp ding cut through the air. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss. The man from the ceremony, the man in the suit, stepped out. The air in the corridor immediately grew colder, heavier. He didn't look at Ronan's friends. He didn't even look at Ronan. His dark, intense eyes found Celeste's and held them. The raw power rolling off him was suffocating, ancient and absolute. It made the Alpha's son seem like a child throwing a tantrum. "Let her go," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a shard of obsidian. It was not a request. Ronan, to his credit, tried to stand his ground. "This is pack business. It doesn't concern you, outsider." The man took a slow, deliberate step forward. "She works for me now." A small smile, devoid of any warmth, touched his lips. "And I find your business methods to be disruptive. Leave, before I decide to disrupt your father's corporate holdings." The threat was veiled but incredibly potent. Ronan's eyes widened slightly. He knew exactly who this was. He released Celeste's arm as if she had burned him and took a stumbling step back. Without another word, he and his cronies turned and practically fled to the emergency stairs. Celeste stood trembling, rubbing her arm, her mind reeling. The man, her savior, turned his full attention back to her. His gaze was just as intense as it had been in the forest, but now there was something else in it, a flicker of something she couldn't name. "My office," he commanded softly. "We need to discuss your promotion." She just stared at him, confused and terrified. "Promotion? You're my executive assistant now," he stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He turned and started walking toward the penthouse elevator, not looking back, because he knew, with an unnerving certainty, that she would follow. And she did. Because what other choice did she have? She followed the Dark King into his glittering castle, trading the familiar cruelty of the wild for the unknown dangers of a gilded cage. Chapter 4. The Obsidian Tower. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a rising glass box that lifted Celeste from the familiar grime of the city into a world of sterile clouds. The man beside her, Kalen Thorne, a name she now knew whispered in the human world with the same mix of fear and awe reserved for alphas, said nothing. He simply stood, a monolith of dark fabric and coiled energy, his presence sucking all the air from the small space. She risked a glance at his reflection in the mirrored walls. His face was a mask of cold control, but his eyes were fixed on her with that same unsettling intensity she remembered from the ceremony. It wasn't a look of pity. It was something sharper, hungrier. When the doors opened, they revealed not an office, but a sprawling penthouse that seemed to float over the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed a glittering tapestry of lights below. The air smelled of nothing, a clean, processed scent that was the opposite of the rich, earthy perfume of the forest she missed. It was beautiful, and it was the most terrifying cage she had ever seen. "Your duties will be simple." Kalen's voice was a low timbre that seemed to vibrate in her bones, cutting through the sterile quiet. He walked toward a massive desk made of dark, polished wood. "You will manage my schedule. You will handle my correspondence. You will be available when I require you to be." He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, from her worn-out shoes to the tired pallor of her skin. "And you will rest. You look depleted." Depleted. The word was so clinical, so precise. It wasn't sad or tired. It was the word a scientist would use for a failing battery. A shiver traced its way down her spine. How could he see that? The ache in her bones flared, a dull throb that was getting harder to ignore. What did he want from her? Was this some strange form of charity, a penance for a sin she didn't understand? The core question of her life echoed in her mind. What am I to you? A broken thing to be fixed? A stray to be pitied? Why? The word escaped her, a breathless whisper. It was a stupid question, a dangerous one, because a Null did not question an alpha. And this man was something far more than any alpha she had ever known. He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Because Ronan Blackwood is a short-sighted fool," he said, the statement a simple, indisputable fact. He threw away an asset. "I do not make the same mistake." An asset. Not a person. Not a mate. An asset. The word was a slap, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about kindness. This was a transaction. He was a king, and she was a piece on his board. It was a role she understood, even if the game was new. Following that chilling declaration, he gestured toward a sleek black tablet on his desk. "Everything you need to know is on there. Your access codes, your schedule, your accounts." He paused. "And the details of your residence." "My residence?" "You will be staying here, in the tower," he clarified, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is more efficient, and it ensures your safety." Her heart plummeted. A prisoner. She was a well-kept prisoner in an obsidian tower. The illusion of freedom she'd had in the city, however grim, was gone. To be so close to this man, to be under his constant, watchful eye, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in a high wind. He saw too much. He saw her weakness, her strange fatigue, the cracks in her soul she tried so desperately to hide. He saw it all, and for some reason she couldn't comprehend, he had decided it belonged to him. The chapter of her life as a lone wolf was over, and a new, terrifying one had just begun. Chapter 5. The First Kindness. The first few days were a blur of quiet terror and crushing inadequacy. The Obsidian Tower was a world of unspoken rules and technology that seemed to mock Celeste's simple pack-upbringing. She felt like a ghost haunting a palace, her worn boots silent on floors so polished they reflected the sky. Kalen was a demanding phantom presence. He was either in meetings behind soundproof glass doors or gone entirely, leaving her with a list of tasks on the sleek tablet that felt like it had been forged in the future. She fumbled with the device, her fingers clumsy, her mind struggling to keep up. The loneliness was a physical weight, heavier here in this silent, empty luxury than it had been in the dirt and shadows of her old life. Consequently, it was a simple, stupid mistake that led to her first real human interaction. A complex coffee order, a wrong button on the machine, and a torrent of hot, dark liquid flooding the counter of the pristine break room. A choked sob of frustration escaped her. She was going to be fired. She was going to be thrown back out into the cold, and this time, she didn't think she had the strength to get up again. "Whoa there, killer, declaring war on the espresso machine?" Celeste spun around. A young woman with bright pink hair and a ridiculously cheerful smile stood in the doorway, holding a tablet of her own. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene. The mess, the fancy machine, and Celeste's tear-streaked face. I'm sorry, I'll clean it up," Celeste stammered, grabbing for paper towels. "Hey, relax," the woman said, her voice warm and completely devoid of judgment. She breezed into the room and unplugged the machine with practiced ease. "This thing has it out for everyone. I'm Jenna, by the way. You must be the new EA, the unicorn." Celeste blinked. "Unicorn?" "Yep. No one's lasted in that job for more than a week. The big boss is intense," Jenna said, her grin conspiratorial. She grabbed a cloth and started helping, her movements efficient and cheerful. "But you look like you can handle it. Though you might want to get some better shoes. Those look like they've walked through a war." She winked, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Celeste felt a genuine smile touch her own lips. It felt foreign. Jenna's kindness was a shock to her system, a balm on a wound she didn't even know was still bleeding. She wasn't a Null to this woman. She was just a coworker, a person. This simple act of acceptance, of being seen without being judged, was more precious than any luxury the tower could offer. Later that afternoon, another small disaster struck. While carrying a stack of files, she stumbled, and the papers scattered across the hallway like fallen leaves. Before she could even begin to gather them, A quiet young man from the mailroom was there, kneeling beside her. "Here, let me help," he said softly. He had kind, gentle eyes and moved with a quiet grace. He didn't say much, just helped her stack the papers, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. A tiny, almost imperceptible spark of energy passed between them, and his eyes widened slightly, a look of recognition she didn't understand. He gave her a small, shy smile before disappearing back into the mailroom. His name was Marcus. This newfound sense of camaraderie, however small, was a lifeline. For the first time, Celeste felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear or despair. It was the beginning of a new pack, a pack of misfits, perhaps, a unicorn, an IT witch, and a quiet mailboy. But it was hers. As the day ended, Jenna popped her head into the office. "Coffee tomorrow? My treat. 10 a.m. sharp. We'll teach you how to tame the beast in the break room." Celeste nodded, a real, genuine nod of acceptance. It was a simple invitation, a normal human thing, but for her it felt like a monumental step, a tether to a world she was just beginning to believe she might have a place in after all. Chapter 6. Silver in His Eyes. As the week progressed, a fragile routine began to form. Celeste learned the rhythms of the tower, the hum of the servers, the quiet intensity of Kaylin's work. She even learned how to operate the coffee machine, thanks to Jenna's patient tutelage. She was beginning to feel less like a ghost and more like a person, at least when Kaylin wasn't around. His presence still set her on edge, a primal instinct she couldn't shake. He was the predator, and she was something else, something he was watching. This fragile peace was shattered during a high-stakes meeting with a rival CEO, a man named Alistair Finch. He was a shark in a tailored suit, with a slick smile and eyes that held the flat, cold look of a predator. From the moment he walked into the boardroom, he dismissed Celeste with a single, condescending glance, as if she were part of the furniture. She did her best to ignore it, focusing on taking the minutes, her fingers flying across the tablet. The meeting was tense, a verbal chess match where millions of dollars were at stake. Alistair was losing, and he knew it. His frustration began to curdle into something ugly. In a bid to undermine Kaylin, he turned his attention to Celeste. "Mr. Thorne, your assistant seems distracted," Alistair said, his voice dripping with false concern. He stood and walked around the table, stopping directly behind her chair. "Perhaps the details of this negotiation are a bit too complex for her?" He placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like a brand. Celeste flinched, her entire body going rigid. Every instinct screamed at her. Danger. And then, the atmosphere in the room changed. It wasn't a shout or a sudden movement. It was a drop in temperature, a sudden oppressive weight that made the air thick and hard to breathe. Celeste heard it before anyone else did. A low guttural sound, barely audible, vibrating up from the floor. A growl. She risked a glance at Kaylin. He hadn't moved from his seat at the head of the table. His hands were resting calmly on the polished surface. But his eyes were no longer the color of dark obsidian. They were molten silver, burning with a cold, primal fury that was utterly inhuman. "Finch," Kaylin said, his voice dangerously soft. "Remove your hand. Now." Alistair, who hadn't noticed the sound, just smirked. "A little sensitive, are we?" Kaylin didn't respond. He simply looked at him. The predatory intensity in that silver gaze was a physical force. Alistair's smirk faltered. The color drained from his face. He snatched his hand back from Celeste's shoulder as if he'd been burned. "The deal is off the table," Kaylin continued in that same, terrifyingly quiet voice. "My company will be acquiring yours. It will not be a friendly takeover. By the time I am done, the only thing you will own is the suit on your back. Now get out of my building." Alistair didn't argue. He scrambled from the room, his bravado stripped away, leaving only raw, naked fear. The other executives followed, their faces pale, avoiding eye contact with the man at the head of the table. The boardroom was suddenly silent. Celeste's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She was frozen, trapped between terror and a confusing, thrilling surge of something. She had been protected. Not just defended. Protected. With a ferocity that went beyond that of a boss for his employee. Slowly, she turned to look at him. The silver in his eyes was receding, but it was still there, swirling in the dark depths. He wasn't looking at the door where Alistair had fled. He was looking at her. His gaze was possessive, absolute, and it pinned her in place. "No one," he said, his voice a low, possessive rumble that resonated deep in her chest, "touches what is mine." Chapter 7. A Touch of Silence. The aftermath of the boardroom clash left a strange quiet in its wake. Kaelin never mentioned the incident again. He simply went back to being a distant, demanding presence, a king ruling from a glass throne. But something had shifted. The air between them was now charged with an unspoken awareness. Celeste felt his eyes on her more often, a heavy, possessive gaze that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. He had called her his. The words echoed in her thoughts, a confusing mix of terror and a shameful, secret thrill. She was his asset, his property, and his to protect. What did that even mean? This new tension made the long nights in the office even more draining. The constant ache in her bones had become a grinding companion, a thief that stole her energy bit by bit. One evening, while cross-referencing files for an overseas merger, the exhaustion finally won. Her head grew heavy, the numbers on the screen blurring into a meaningless dance. She blinked, and the next thing she knew, a soft jolt snapped her awake. Her head had fallen forward, and she'd almost slipped from her chair. A strong hand clamped down on her shoulder, steadying her. "Celeste." Kaelin's voice was a low rumble right beside her ear. She hadn't even heard him approach. Mortified, she tried to straighten up, but her limbs felt like lead. As she shifted, his hand slid from her shoulder to her bare arm, his fingers wrapping around her skin to keep her from falling. And then, it happened. The pain, the constant, deep-seated ache she had lived with for years, vanished. It didn't fade. It was simply gone, snuffed out like a candle flame. A wave of pure, unadulterated bliss washed over her, so potent it made her gasp. For one breathtaking second, there was no weariness, no drain, no whisper of the poison that was slowly claiming her. There was only silence. A perfect, peaceful quiet in her own body. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock, and met his. Kaelin's face was inches from hers, and his expression was one of stunned revelation. His usually guarded features were slack, his dark eyes wide. The harsh lines of control around his mouth had softened. She realized he was feeling it too. The connection. His grip on her arm tightened almost unconsciously, a desperate, seeking pressure. What did he feel? What relief could a man that powerful possibly find in a touch? The moment stretched, a fragile bubble of shared, miraculous peace. It was more intimate than a kiss, more profound than any whispered confession. It was two broken things for a single heartbeat, making each other whole. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. He released her as if her skin had suddenly become molten lava. The pain crashed back into her, a tidal wave of familiar agony, and a small, wounded sound escaped her lips. Across from her, Kaelin flinched, the hard mask of control slamming back into place. But she had seen it, the flicker of raw, desperate longing in his eyes before he hid it away. He took a step back, putting a universe of distance between them in a single motion. "You are overworked," he stated, his voice tight and formal again. "Go to your residence. Rest." He turned and strode out of the office without another word, leaving her trembling in the silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was an empty one, defined by the memory of that perfect, painless moment. Celeste slowly touched the spot on her arm where his hand had been, feeling the ghost of his warmth. She now had a new, dangerous secret. This terrifying, possessive man who owned her life was also the only thing in the world that could take away her pain. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, she was going to crave that touch again. Chapter 8. The Ghost at the Gala. Kaylin announced the corporate gala as if it were a military briefing. "You will accompany me. There is a designer on retainer. They will be at your residence this afternoon." It was a command, not an invitation. Celeste found herself being zipped into a gown of midnight blue silk that felt like a second skin, her silver hair styled in a way that made her look like a stranger. A beautiful, elegant stranger who felt completely out of place. This was his world, a world of glittering sharks and fake smiles, and she was being put on display. As what, she wasn't sure. The ballroom was a galaxy of shimmering lights and quiet, predatory conversations. Kaylin never left her side. His hand was a constant, searing presence on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. Every time his fingers brushed her skin, she felt a phantom echo of that perfect silence, a desperate pull that made it hard to breathe. Was this torture or a twisted kind of heaven? She could feel the eyes of everyone on them, the whispers and questions. Who was the girl the Obsidian King kept so close? Following a particularly tense conversation with a rival, Kaylin was pulled away by a board member. "Stay here," he murmured, his voice a low command meant only for her. "I will be back." She was alone for less than a minute before a woman approached. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with fiery red hair and a confidence that radiated off her in waves. Her eyes, the color of emeralds, were sharp and intelligent, and they were fixed on Celeste with an unnerving intensity. "You must be the new one," the woman said, her voice smooth as velvet, but with an edge of something sharp beneath. "He always did like collecting pretty, broken things." Celeste stiffened. "I'm sorry, I don't—" "Oh, you don't have to pretend with me. I'm Lyra," she introduced herself, a sad, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I was one of his projects a long, long time ago, before he got tired of me." The name didn't mean anything, but the possessive way she said his sent a chill down Celeste's spine. This was a ghost from his past. A rival. "Kaylin is my boss," Celeste said, her voice firmer than she expected. Lyra let out a soft, pitying laugh. "Is that what he calls it now? He's a collector, darling. He finds things that are unique, that are flawed, that normal people can't figure out, and he puts them in his pretty glass tower and studies them until he understands how they work." Her gaze was piercing, filled with a genuine, painful sincerity. "He doesn't save things. He solves them, and when the puzzle is finished, he puts the toy away." Every word was a drop of poison, seeping into the fragile trust Celeste had begun to build. Lyra was describing Kaylin's actions perfectly. His clinical assessment of her, his control, his obsession with her depleted state. The core question of her existence screamed in her mind. Was she a person to him or a problem to be solved? "He will make you feel like you are the center of the universe," Lyra continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He will protect you, cherish you, make you believe you are the only thing that can quiet the storm inside him. And it will all be a lie, a beautiful, perfect lie designed to keep you right where he wants you." Celeste's blood ran cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what it's like to be one of his pretty poisons," Lyra said, her eyes filled with a deep, ancient hurt. "And no one was there to warn me." She leaned in closer. "If you don't believe me, just ask him about his other work. Ask him about Subject 4. With that, she smiled, a sad, final little smile, and melted back into the crowd, leaving Celeste standing alone in the center of the glittering ballroom. The noise, the music, the laughter, it all faded away. She was left with only Lyra's words, a toxic seed of doubt that had just been planted directly in her heart. And it was already beginning to grow. Chapter 9. Subject 7. The ride back to the tower was a silent, suffocating affair. Kaylin sat beside her in the back of the car, the space between them charged with a new, sharp-edged tension. Celeste stared out the window at the blurred city lights, Lyra's words replaying in her mind on a loop. He collects pretty broken things. Ask him about Subject 4. She could feel Kaylin's gaze on her, heavy and questioning, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. If she did, she was afraid he would see the doubt, the fear, the ugly suspicion that was now twisting in her gut. Who was Subject 4? And what, in his cold, clinical world, was her number? As a result of this encounter, the fragile dynamic between them shattered. The next few days were a cold war fought in glances and silences. Celeste was no longer just timid. She was wary, skittish. She flinched when he came near, her body instinctively recoiling from the touch she now secretly craved and deeply distrusted. She did her work with a remote, robotic efficiency, answering his questions with the bare minimum of words required. She was building a wall, brick by painful brick. Her withdrawal drove Kaylin to the edge of his formidable control. He couldn't understand the sudden shift. One moment they had shared that silent, miraculous peace. The next, she was looking at him as if he were a monster. Her fear and distance stoked the possessive, primal fire inside him. He became more demanding, his presence more suffocating. He would find reasons to call her into his office, to stand too close, to watch her work, as if trying to force a reaction to break through the icy barrier she had erected. To Celeste, his actions were a terrifying confirmation of Lyra's warning. His possessiveness no longer felt protective. It felt like ownership. His intensity no longer felt like focus. It felt like an observation. She was a specimen under a microscope, and he was the scientist growing impatient with his experiment. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, she began to investigate. Using the quiet moments when Kaylin was in meetings, she used the skills Jenna had taught her to navigate the labyrinthine servers of Thorn Industries. She searched for Lyra. Nothing. She searched for Subject 4. A wall of access denials. The fact that the files were so heavily guarded was more damning than anything she could have found. Her search made her more aware of the cage she was in. She started noticing the discreet cameras in the corners of the rooms, the pressure plates in the floor, the way her keycard only granted her access to specific areas. The Obsidian Tower wasn't just a home. It was a high-tech prison designed with a terrifying, bespoke precision. He hadn't brought her here for her safety. He had brought her here for his control. One night, fueled by a mix of fear and defiance, she dug deeper. She ran a diagnostic on Kaylin's personal network, a long shot she was sure would lead nowhere. But then something popped up. A hidden partition, a ghost drive masked from the main server. It was encrypted with a level of security that was almost military grade, but the folder's name was simple. One word: Sanctuary. A cold dread washed over her, so profound it made her feel dizzy. She didn't know what was inside, but she knew with a bone-deep certainty that it held the truth about Lyra, about Subject 4, and about the pretty, broken thing he was keeping on the top floor. The sanctuary wasn't a place of peace. It was a place of secrets, and she knew she had to find a way inside. Chapter 10, Sanctuary. The word was a poison. Sanctuary. It echoed in the quiet moments, a whisper of dread that coiled in Celeste's stomach. It was a lock, and she was convinced the truth of her life was trapped on the other side. But Kaylin's digital security was a fortress, and she was just a girl who had only recently learned how to use a tablet. She needed help. She needed her pack. She found Jenna in the server room, a place Jenna called her icy kingdom. The air was cold and hummed with the sound of 1,000 tiny electronic heartbeats. "Hey, unicorn," Jenna greeted her, not looking up from a tangle of brightly colored wires. "Come to pay tribute to the gods of Wi-Fi?" Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs. "I need a favor, Jenna. A big one. A dangerous one." That got her attention. Jenna swiveled in her chair, her expression sharpening with concern. She took in Celeste's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes. "Okay, you look like you've seen a ghost. Talk to me." It was hard to find the words. How could she explain the primal fear, the sense of being an insect under glass without sounding insane? I think our boss is hiding something," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Something about me. There's a hidden file partition on his private server. It's called Sanctuary. I need to see what's inside." Jenna was silent for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching Celeste's. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what Celeste expected to find. She simply saw the raw, desperate terror in her friend's eyes. This wasn't about corporate espionage. This was something deeper, something personal and painful. "Getting into Thorne's personal server is not easy," Jenna said slowly, a thoughtful frown on her face. "It's a digital fortress wrapped in a nightmare and guarded by a three-headed Cerberus of code, but..." A slow, mischievous grin spread across her face. "I've always loved a good puzzle." The plan was terrifyingly simple. Jenna would create a diversion, a system-wide diagnostic that would momentarily overwhelm the security protocols, creating a tiny blind spot, a window of 5 minutes. During that time, Celeste had to get to Kaylin's personal terminal in his office and access the drive. Following Jenna's precise instructions, Celeste waited until Kaylin was called into an emergency video conference. Her hands were slick with sweat as she slipped into his empty office. The room felt different without him in it, like a predator's den while the beast was away. It still hummed with his power. She sat at his desk, the leather of his chair cold against her skin. Her breath hitched. On the corner of the desk sat a small steaming mug. It was a specific herbal tea, a rare blend known to help with chronic fatigue. He had left it for her. A kind gesture, a thoughtful act. For a heart-stopping moment, her resolve wavered. Was she wrong about him? Was Lyra just a bitter ghost? A message from Jenna flashed on her own tablet. "Window is open. Go." She pushed the doubt away. The kindness could be part of the lie. She had to know. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, typing the commands Jenna had drilled into her. The screen filled with lines of code. Firewalls fell, back doors opened. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime. Come on, come on. And then it happened. The final encryption layer dissolved. A single file list appeared on the screen, stark and simple against the black background. Sanctuary. She was in. She had made it past the gates. Now she just had to face the monster inside. Chapter 11. Subject 7. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild drum in the crushing silence of the office. Her hand trembled as she moved the cursor, clicking on the first file. It wasn't a corporate document. It was a research log. A cold clinical analysis of a shifter bloodline in decay. The name on the file was Lyra, Subject 4. Celeste's blood ran cold as she scanned the notes. Words like genetic degradation, failed stabilization attempts, and psychological instability jumped out at her. It was a horrifying detached record of Kaylin's attempts to fix a person as if she were a broken machine. Lyra wasn't a bitter ex-lover. She was a failed experiment. A wave of nausea washed over her. She almost stopped. She didn't want to know anymore, but she had to. She had to know where she fit into this chamber of horrors. She scrolled down the file list, her eyes searching for her own name. And then she saw it. A file created the day after the rejection ceremony. The name wasn't Celeste. Subject 7. The Null anomaly. Her world tilted, the floor seeming to drop away beneath her. With a shaking finger, she opened the file. It was all there. Everything. Blood analysis from a cup she'd drunk from. Thermal imaging of her body while she slept, with the poison seal on her back glowing a faint, sick purple, labeled a unique parasitic brand with energy siphoning properties. There were notes detailing her fatigue levels, her emotional responses, her moments of weakness. He had been studying her from the very beginning. The worst part, the part that made a strangled, agonized sound rip from her throat, was the final entry. It was from the night before, after he had found her asleep at her desk. Log entry. Subject 7 exhibits extreme positive reaction to direct physical contact. Epidermal contact for approximately 7.2 seconds resulted in a complete, temporary cessation of the brand's energy drain. Subject's vitals spiked to healthy levels. Simultaneously, all symptoms of the echo curse in my own system were nullified. The effect is potent, immediate, and clearly addictive for both parties. The subject is not just a potential cure. The subject is the cure. The kind gesture with the tea, the concerned questions about her rest, the protective moments, the hand on her arm, it was all data. Every interaction, every seemingly gentle act was just another part of his cold, calculated experiment. She wasn't a person. She wasn't an asset. She was a thing, a cure to be harvested. The core question of her life, is my worth what I am to others, was answered. To Ronan, she was a disgrace. To Kaylin, she was a remedy. She had never, not once, been allowed to simply be Celeste. The trust she had so foolishly started to feel for him curdled into a black, toxic hatred. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like it was rewriting her on a cellular level. A soft chime echoed through the office. The private elevator, ascending. He was coming back. The thought was a lightning strike of pure, unadulterated terror. She couldn't be here. He couldn't find her. With frantic, clumsy movements, she shoved a tiny data drive into the terminal, her mind screaming one single, desperate command. Copy. Copy it all. Chapter 12. Flight from the tower. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. The progress bar on the screen was a slow, torturous crawl. Every second was a lifetime. The soft whir of the elevator grew louder, a mechanical beast climbing its shaft to devour her. Faster, please, faster. The final file copied over. A small pop-up announced the transfer was complete. She ripped the drive from the port, her hand closing around the tiny rectangular piece of plastic that held the truth of her monstrous captivity. With a final, desperate surge of speed, she cleared the screen, shoving his keyboard back into its perfect, precise position. She didn't dare look toward the elevator. She just ran. She bolted from the office, not toward the main lifts, but toward the fire exit she'd seen on the building schematics. Her worn boots, the ones Jenna had teased her about, were silent on the plush carpet as she fled. The heavy steel door to the stairwell clicked shut behind her, the sound a final damning gunshot. The silence of the stairwell was a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of her own heart. She plunged down the steps, the concrete unforgiving under her feet. Each step was a prayer. Don't let him find me. Please don't let him find me. She could picture it perfectly in her mind. Kaylin stepping into his office, his head tilting, his primal senses telling him that the air was wrong, that his territory had been invaded. He would know. He would know in an instant that his experiment had escaped the lab. She didn't stop running until she burst out of the building's ground floor into the cool night air of the city. Rain had begun to fall, a soft drizzle that plastered her silver hair to her face. She didn't have a destination. She just ran, a wild, cornered thing, until one single, clear thought pierced through her panic. Jenna. She found her way to Jenna's apartment building, a scruffy walk-up that was a world away from Kaylin's obsidian tower. She pounded on the door, her knuckles raw. When Jenna opened it, her cheerful smile died on her lips the second she saw Celeste's face. "Oh, honey," was all she said, pulling Celeste inside, into the warmth and the clutter and the smell of coffee. Marcus was there, too, having stayed for dinner, and his kind face filled with alarm. Celeste couldn't speak. She just collapsed onto the sofa, the sobs she had been holding back finally breaking free, tearing through her in great shuddering waves. She was no longer Kaylin's asset. She was no longer Subject 7. She was a refugee, a fugitive with a stolen secret. The fragile life she had started to build had been a lie, and the kindness she'd received from the man who held her captive was just the gilded bait in a trap. There was no going back. The point of no return had come and gone without her even realizing it. She huddled on the couch, the tiny data drive clutched in her hand like a talisman. It was the proof of her dehumanization. It was her only weapon. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was the reason the king of the Obsidian Tower would now hunt her to the ends of the earth. The hunt had begun. Chapter 13. Every Shadow. Hiding in Jenna's chaotic, colorful apartment was like living in a different universe. The air smelled of coffee and cinnamon, a stark contrast to the sterile nothingness of the tower. For a few days, a fragile sense of safety began to knit itself around Celeste's frayed nerves. Jenna was a force of nature, her fierce loyalty a shield. Marcus was a quiet, steady presence, his calm demeanor a balm on her terror. They didn't push her to talk about the data drive she clutched like a holy relic. They just made her tea, told her terrible jokes, and treated her like a person. For the first time, she felt what it was like to have a real pack, a small, strange one built on kindness instead of power. But Caelan Thorne was not a beast who forgot the scent of his prey. His hunt was not one of claws and fangs. It was a cold, silent, and systematic dismantling of her world. It began on the third day. Jenna was trying to show Celeste a funny video online when the internet connection just died. Not just the Wi-Fi, the entire building's service went dark. An hour later, her phone went dead too. No signal. That's weird, Jenna muttered, a frown creasing her brow. Must be a local outage. But it wasn't. The next morning, Jenna's bank card was declined when she tried to buy groceries. When she called the bank, they told her accounts were frozen due to a security investigation. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of their fragile sanctuary. Then, Marcus came home from work, his kind face pale and drawn. "They know," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Two men from corporate security visited the mailroom. They asked about me, about my association with you. They mentioned my immigration status." Guilt, sharp and suffocating, clawed at Celeste's throat. This was her fault. She was a curse, a walking disaster that brought ruin to anyone who showed her a shred of kindness. To be cared for, to be protected, to be loved. These were not things meant for her. Her very existence was a danger to the people she was starting to care about. "I have to go," she said, her voice a broken whisper. She stood up, her body trembling. "He's doing this to you because of me. If I leave, he'll stop." "Don't be an idiot," Jenna snapped, her fear making her sharp. She grabbed Celeste's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You walk out that door, you're dead. We're in this together. That's what a pack does." "She's right," Marcus added, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't abandon our own." Their loyalty was a precious, painful gift she didn't deserve. But as she looked at their determined faces, she knew they wouldn't let her run. They were willing to face the storm with her. Her heart ached with a love so fierce it almost felt like grief, because she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the storm was no longer coming. It was already here. Later that night, unable to sleep, she crept to the window. She peered down through a gap in the blinds at the rain-slicked street below, and she saw it. A sleek black car, the exact same model as Caelan's, was parked across the street under a flickering street lamp. It was empty, unmoving. It was just sitting there, watching. A silent predator waiting patiently for its cornered prey to make a mistake. He had found them. The walls were closing in. Chapter 14. No Sanctuary. The black car remained, a silent sentinel of their doom. For 24 hours it sat there, an extension of Caelan's oppressive, watchful presence. The tension inside the apartment was a living thing. A fourth roommate that breathed down their necks and made every creak of the floorboards sound like a threat. They spoke in whispers. They ate without tasting. They were trapped, waiting for the king to make his move on the board. The waiting was its own special kind of torture. Then it came. Not a crash of breaking doors or a roar of fury. Just a simple, polite knock on the door. It was so normal, so civilized, that it was utterly terrifying. Jenna, her face a mask of defiance, went to the peephole. Her body went rigid. "It's him," she breathed, her voice tight with a fear she was trying desperately to hide. "Don't answer it," Celeste whispered from the hallway, where she was hiding. Marcus stood beside her, his hand hovering near a heavy lamp, a futile gesture against the power that stood on the other side of the door. "He knows we're here, Celeste," Jenna whispered back. "Running is over." She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. Kalen Thorne stood in the grimy hallway of the apartment building, yet he looked as if he belonged on a throne. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark coat, raindrops clinging to the fine wool like tiny diamonds. He wasn't raging. He was worse. He was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered past Jenna and found Celeste in the shadows of the hall. "You have something that belongs to me," he said, his voice a low, silken threat that was meant only for her. "She's not a thing," Jenna snapped, her courage a small, bright flame against the coming dark. "And she's not going anywhere with you." Kalen's gaze shifted to Jenna. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Jenna Kowalski," he said, her name sounding like a verdict. "Top of your class at MIT, a prodigy in network security. You have a bright future, or you did. I can make one phone call and you will be blacklisted from every tech firm on the planet. Your credit will be ruined. Your digital life will be erased. You will, for all intents and purposes, cease to exist." He then turned his calm, devastating gaze to Marcus. And Marcus, a member of the summer court, living in the human world on a precarious work visa. It would be a shame if the immigration authorities were to receive an anonymous tip about a fae violating the terms of his stay. A terrible, terrible shame. It was not a physical attack. It was a dissection. He had taken their lives, their hopes, their fears, and laid them bare on the floor of the dingy hallway. Jenna and Marcus were brave. They were loyal. But they were terrified. Celeste could see it in the way Jenna's hands trembled, in the way the color drained from Marcus's face. She was destroying them. Her presence was a poison, just like the one in her own veins. To save them, she had to surrender. She had to give the monster what he wanted. As she took a step out of the shadows, ready to sacrifice herself, a new scent cut through the air. It came from the alley behind the building, a smell of pine and wet earth and old familiar arrogance. Ronan. A sharp, magical tug pulled at her soul, the broken rejection bond screaming to life like a phantom limb. A snarl, loud and feral, ripped through the night. Kalen spun around, his own eyes flashing silver, sensing the new threat. He was too late. The back window of the apartment shattered inward, and two wolves, their fur matted and their eyes glowing with hunger, crashed into the room. Kalen's Cold War had given the old enemy the opening they needed. Chapter 15. Chained to the altar, chaos erupted. It was a storm of snarling teeth and primal fury. The two wolves that crashed through the window were a blur of motion, their sole focus on the most powerful threat in the room, Kalen. He met them with a roar that was not human, a sound of pure, untamed power that shook the very walls of the apartment. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold, a primal beast shedding its thin human veneer. But he was outnumbered, his attention divided. He was trying to fight, to protect Jenna and Marcus, who were cowering in the corner, and to get to her all at the same time. Celeste was frozen, a statue of pure terror. This was her fault, this violence, this bloodshed. It was all because of her. She was a prize to be fought over, a broken toy two monsters wanted to possess. In the swirling chaos, a new figure appeared in the shattered window frame. Ronan. He wasn't in his wolf form. He stood there in the pouring rain, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face as he watched the mayhem he had unleashed. His eyes found hers. "Time to come home, little Null," he sneered. Before Kaelin could react, another wolf, larger than the others, lunged from the shadows of the hallway. It wasn't aiming for Kaelin. It was aiming for her. The broken bond was a magical beacon, a chain that still connected her to this pack, and they were pulling on it. She screamed as rough claws dug into her clothes, dragging her backward. Her last sight was of Kaelin. He had just thrown one of the wolves through a wall. He turned, his eyes blazing with silver fury, and saw her being dragged away. A roar of pure, desperate rage tore from his throat, a sound of a king watching his kingdom burn. He started toward her, but the other wolves threw themselves at him, a wave of fur and fury blocking his path. He had failed. His hunt, his meticulous cold war. It had all been for nothing. He had lost her. She was dragged down the stairs and thrown into the back of a truck. The world was a blur of rain and fear. They were taking her back to the place of her greatest shame, her most profound heartbreak. The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. She had run from one cage only to be thrown into another. She was an object, a thing to be used. And maybe this was all she deserved. Maybe this was the only fate for a broken, worthless thing like her. The journey was a hazy nightmare. When they finally pulled her from the truck, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs. They were at the clearing. The sacred altar gleamed under the light of a rising, blood-red moon. They dragged her forward and chained her wrists to the cold, unforgiving stone. She lay there shivering and defeated, the rain washing the city grime from her skin. Ronan stood over her, his eyes gleaming with a sick, possessive triumph. "You see, Celeste?" he said, his voice a low, mocking purr. "You never could escape. The goddess gave you to me. And now, I'm finally going to take what's mine." Hope was gone. Her allies were lost. Her protector had failed. She was alone, chained to an altar of ash, waiting for a monster to consume her. The dark night of her soul had arrived. Chapter 16. The spark in the ash chained to the cold, unforgiving stone of the altar, Celeste felt the last of her fight drain away into the thirsty earth. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and thick. Above, the blood moon cast a sickly crimson glow over the clearing, painting the world in shades of rust and ruin. This was it, the end of her short, quiet, pointless life. Despair was a heavy blanket, suffocating her, and for a moment, she welcomed the weight. It was easier to sink than to struggle. Ronan stood over her, his face a mask of triumph. But it was his father, Alpha Blackwood, who approached the altar, his hands holding a wicked-looking ceremonial knife. "The bloodline has grown weak over generations," the Alpha intoned, his voice a low, gravelly chant. He was not speaking to her, but to the moon, to the spirits, to the dark power he was about to invoke. "The old strength has faded, but the goddess, in her wisdom, left us a key, a vessel of pure, ancient power, hidden in the guise of a Null." He raised the knife. Celeste closed her eyes, bracing for the sting of the blade, but it didn't cut her skin. He drew a complex symbol on the stone of the altar just above her head, using the knife to carve into the rock itself. "Tonight," he roared, his voice filled with a feverish fervor, "we reclaim the lost light. We will purify the bloodline with the fire of the moonstone." As he finished the symbol, a wave of magic, cold and slimy, washed over her. It was a vile, invasive force, seeping into her pores, probing, searching. It felt like 1,000 spiders crawling under her skin, looking for something. She whimpered, her body arching against the chains. The magic was a living thing, a hungry parasite, and it was focused on the hollow space inside her where her wolf should have been. It pushed deeper, and the agony was immense. She felt like she was being torn apart from the inside out. But then, it happened. In the deepest, most desolate part of her soul, the dark magic touched something. Not an emptiness, not a void, a spark. It was tiny, a single dormant ember that had been buried under a lifetime of shame and a magical seal of poison. It was a flicker of warmth in an ocean of cold, and the ritual's magic, in its greedy attempt to drain her, was unintentionally feeding it. The spark didn't just flicker, it flared. A revelation, sharp and stunning, pierced through her despair. They weren't trying to destroy a worthless thing. They were trying to steal a priceless one. She wasn't a null. She wasn't an empty vessel. She was a well, deep and full, and they were trying to siphon her dry before she ever learned she held water. The knowledge was a shock to her system, a jolt of lightning that burned away the fog of her resignation. Her entire life had been a lie, not just of her worthlessness, but of her true nature. They hadn't rejected her because she was weak. They had suppressed her because she was powerful. The core belief that had defined her, I am broken, was a cage they had built around her. And they had just shown her the key. Hope, fierce and sharp, ignited in the ashes of her despair. She was no longer a victim waiting for the end. She was a prisoner, and she was finally ready to fight for her own life. Chapter 17. Two Storms. The ritual intensified. The cold tendrils of Alpha Blackwood's magic wrapped around the growing spark within her, pulling with a greedy, desperate force. Before, the sensation would have shattered her. Now, with the truth blazing in her mind, she had an anchor. The pain was still immense, but it was no longer the pain of annihilation. It was the agony of a becoming, a violent, transformative struggle. Her life was a war, and she had just realized she was armed. Her plan was not one of logic. It was pure, primal instinct. She could feel the magical siphon, the channel they were using to drain her. It was a twisted, ugly thing, and at its core, she could feel its connection to the broken rejection bond. Ronan was the key. He was the conduit. To survive, she had to fight him for control of that link. It was a desperate, impossible idea, but it was the only one she had. As she focused her will inward, gathering her strength around that tiny, growing flame, the voices of her captors cut through her concentration. They were arrogant, basking in the glow of their assured victory. "The wards are holding strong," Ronan said, his voice smug. "Even if the primal gets past the outer patrols, he will never break the circle before the ritual is complete." Alpha Blackwood grunted in agreement. "He is a force of nature. I will grant him that. But he is one wolf. He will break against the strength of this pack. By the time he reaches us, the power will be ours, and you, my son, will be strong enough to crush him. The primal is coming." The words were a balm to Celeste's raw nerves. Kaelin. He hadn't abandoned her. He hadn't given up. He was out there, right now, fighting through an entire pack to get to her. He was fighting for his asset, his cure, his subject. The thought should have been cold comfort, but it wasn't. The memory of his silver eyes, burning with a fury that was entirely for her, was not the look of a scientist. It was the look of a king, of a protector, of a mate. A new resolve, hard as diamond, formed in her heart. She was not alone in this fight. He was fighting for her from the outside, a storm of primal rage against their walls. She would fight for him, and for herself, from the inside. She had to hold on. She had to survive long enough for their two storms to collide. Strengthened by this realization, she gathered every ounce of her will, every flicker of her newfound power, and focused it on the magical link that bound her to Ronan. She couldn't break it. Not yet. But maybe she could push back. She took a metaphorical breath, and then, with all her strength, she shoved. It was a psychic, magical push, a silent scream of defiance sent directly down the siphon. Out on the edge of the altar, Ronan cried out, stumbling back a step as if he'd been physically struck. A flicker of pain and surprise crossed his arrogant face. He looked down at her, his eyes wide with disbelief, then narrowing with fury. "She's fighting back!" Alpha Blackwood just laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Let her. It changes nothing. But it did. Celeste felt it. He had felt her. For the first time in her life, she had landed a blow. And it was just the beginning. Chapter 18. The First Roar. Fight me, little Null, Ronan sneered, recovering his composure. He stalked back to the edge of the altar, his eyes burning with a new, cruel intensity. It will only make the prize that much sweeter when I finally break you. The internal battle began in earnest. The dark magic pulled, a relentless, greedy tide seeking to drown her spark. But now, Celeste pushed back. It was a psychic tug-of-war, an agonizing struggle fought in the landscape of her own soul. Each time she resisted, a wave of pain crashed through her, but with it came a surge of power, a feeling of her dormant abilities stirring, stretching, waking from a lifetime of slumber. The spark was no longer a flicker. It was a warm, defiant glow, a tiny sun in the darkness. She was exhausting herself, her physical body trembling violently against the chains, but she was holding her ground. From the edge of the forest came a sound, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a sharp, agonized howl that was cut short. It was not the sound of one of their pack. The warriors stationed around the clearing grew restless, their wolfish senses on high alert. They shifted their weight, their eyes darting from the ritual to the dark, silent trees. "Hold your positions!" Alpha Blackwood commanded, his voice tight. "He is only one—" His words were cut off by another sound. A crash, like a giant tree being snapped in two, followed by a chorus of panicked yelps. The sounds were getting closer. The predator was toying with them, striking from the shadows, dismantling their defenses one by one. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of blood and fear. Ronan was distracted, his focus on the ritual faltering as his gaze flickered toward the encroaching chaos. This was her chance. Celeste gathered her strength, the warm glow inside her flaring brighter, and shoved against the magical link with all her might. Ronan cried out again, this time dropping to one knee, his face pale. And then the roar came. It was a sound that did not belong in the modern world. It was a sound from a forgotten age of gods and monsters. It was a roar of pure, world-breaking, primal fury. It was not the sound of a wolf. It was the sound of a force of nature. It ripped through the night, shaking the very ground, making the leaves tremble on the trees. Every wolf in the clearing, including the alpha, flinched, their pack instincts screaming at them in the face of a true, ancient apex predator. That was Kalen. And he was done playing games. The warriors were now in a state of barely controlled panic, torn between the alpha's commands and the primal terror that roar had ignited. Alpha Blackwood screamed at them to hold the line, to finish the ritual, but it was too late. The storm had arrived. The first of Ronan's warriors burst back into the clearing, not as a proud soldier, but as a broken, terrified mess, thrown through the air to land in a heap. He was followed by a shadow, a blur of motion so fast it was hard to track. It was huge, black, and its eyes burned with molten silver. The external battle had begun. Celeste, feeling the shift in power, drew in a ragged breath. The internal war was not over. She focused on the link to Ronan, gathering her light for another assault, for another push. The two fronts of the battle were about to collide, and she would be the epicenter of the explosion. Chapter 19. The Shattering. The clearing was a whirlwind of primal chaos. Kalen, in his full primal form, was a living nightmare of shadow and fury. He was not a wolf. He was a relic of a forgotten age, a creature of myth and power made real. He moved through the pack warriors with a devastating grace, each strike a final, brutal sentence. The crimson light of the blood moon gleamed on his black fur, and his silver eyes burned with a righteous, holy fire. Celeste watched, chained and helpless, as the king fought for his kingdom of two. He was magnificent, he was terrifying, and he was doing it all for her. While the external battle raged, the internal war reached its peak. Alpha Blackwood, his face a mask of desperation, screamed at his son, "Now, Ronan! Take it all now before he reaches us!" Ronan, seeing his father about to be overwhelmed by the primal force of Kaelin, made his final, fatal mistake. He abandoned all pretense of a slow, careful ritual and shoved all of his will, all of his power, down the magical siphon, trying to rip the power from Celeste in one violent act. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that threatened to annihilate her. The spark of her power, her tiny sun, was about to be extinguished. But as Ronan's full, desperate power flooded the link between them, he gave her exactly what she needed. A direct path, a clear channel, a bridge to her enemy. He thinks I am a well to be drained, she thought, a strange, lucid calm descending over her in the heart of the storm. He is wrong. I am the water, and the water decides when the dam will break. She stopped pushing back. She stopped resisting. For a single, terrifying second, she let his power flood in, and then she took control. She gathered her inner light, no longer a spark, but a blazing, incandescent star, and seized the torrent of magic. She bent it to her will, and with a silent, soul-deep roar that mirrored the one Kaelin had unleashed on the clearing, she sent it all hurtling back up the siphon. It was not a push, it was a detonation. Ronan screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony as her raw, untamed moonstone power surged into him. The rejection bond, the rotten, twisted chain that had bound her to him, shattered into a million pieces of light. A wave of pure, white energy exploded outward from her body. It was not a violent force, but it was absolute. It washed over the clearing, silent and brilliant. The effect was instantaneous. The pack wolves, fueled by dark, borrowed magic, whimpered and collapsed. The power ripped from them. Ronan was thrown backward from the altar, his body smoking with the pure light he had tried to steal. Alpha Blackwood, caught in the blast, staggered, his strength fading. The light cleared. The fighting had stopped. Kaelin stood over the defeated Alpha, his massive form heaving, his silver eyes fixed on her. He had won his battle. And chained to the altar, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence, Celeste knew she had finally, truly won hers. Her transformation was complete. She had not been saved by a king. She had become a queen. Chapter 20. Silence and Light. The clearing was unnervingly quiet in the aftermath, the only sound the soft drip of rain from the pine needles. The heavy crimson light of the blood moon had softened to a gentle, silvery glow. Kaelin moved toward the altar, the ground trembling slightly with each step. With a single, effortless swipe of his massive claws, he shattered the iron chains that bound Celeste's wrists. Freed, she slowly sat up, her body aching, but her soul felt lighter than it had in her entire life. Kaelin shifted, the terrifying primal form melting away, leaving the man in its place. He was naked, his skin covered in blood, some his, some from his enemies, and deep wounds crisscrossed his chest and arms. But his eyes, now a deep, familiar obsidian, held no pain. They held only a profound, breathtaking awe. They were fixed on her. He reached out a hand, not to claim, not to command, but to gently, reverently touch her face. His fingers were warm against her cool skin. The moment he touched her, it happened. The true fated mate bond, no longer blocked by a poison seal or a wall of betrayal, snapped into place. It was not a violent collision. It was the sound of the universe humming in perfect harmony. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated knowing. She felt his centuries of loneliness, his deep well of pain from the curse, the crushing weight of his crown, and she felt his overwhelming, all-consuming love for her. It was a tidal wave of emotion, but it didn't drown her. It completed her. Through the bond, she felt the echo curse in him go silent, not just quiet, gone, healed by the light of his moonstone mate. At the same time, his primal strength flowed into her, washing away the last of the poison, healing the soul-deep weariness she had carried since birth. They were not two broken things. They were two halves of a single perfect whole. He sank to his knees before her on the altar, his head bowed, a king kneeling to his queen. "Celeste," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was reverence. She reached out and gently tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Kaelin," she said, her own voice clear and strong, a voice she barely recognized as her own. They turned their attention to the defeated wolves. Ronan was unconscious, his body twitching. Alpha Blackwood was on his knees, his power broken, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. It was Celeste who spoke, her new authority settling on her like a mantle. "You wanted to purify your bloodline," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear power. "You will have your wish. Your pack is disbanded. Your lands are forfeit. The wolves who followed you will have a choice. Learn to live in peace or be exiled as I was. That is my judgment." The Alpha stared at her, at the quiet, broken Null who had just dictated the fate of his entire world. Kaelin remained kneeling, his silence a sign of his absolute support. He was her king, but he was also her subject. She looked at him, at the fierce, primal beast who had torn through an army for her, and she finally understood. Her worth was not something he gave her. It was something he had seen in her all along, and now she finally saw it in herself. Chapter 21. The Mating Shockwave. They returned to the obsidian tower, but it was no longer a prison. The cold glass walls seemed to glow with a new warmth, the sterile silence replaced by a comforting hum of shared presence. The city lights below were not a reminder of a world she didn't belong to, but a kingdom spread at their feet. Her kingdom. Their kingdom. Celeste stood in front of the massive mirror in the penthouse, looking at a stranger. The girl in the reflection had silver hair, yes, but her eyes were different. They no longer held the haunted, hunted look of a stray. They shone with a quiet, confident light, the glow of a star that had finally found its place in the sky. She touched the spot on her back where the poison seal had been. There was no mark, no scar, only smooth, warm skin. She was whole. Kaelin entered the room, now cleaned and dressed, the wounds on his body already beginning to heal. He stopped behind her, his reflection joining hers in the mirror. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, his expression one of profound, unguarded love. The mask of the Obsidian King was gone, leaving only the man, the wolf, the mate. "For 500 years," he said, his voice a low, raw whisper that held the weight of centuries. "I lived in silence. I built this empire of glass and steel to keep the world out, to keep the noise of my curse from driving me mad. I thought this tower was my sanctuary." He stepped closer, his hands coming to rest on her waist, his touch a gentle, grounding heat. "I was wrong. It was just a cage. You are my sanctuary, Celeste." It was the confession she had never known she needed. He was completely, utterly vulnerable before her. The great, powerful primal lichen was laying his heart, his soul, at her feet. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She felt the phantom echo of his pain, the ghost of his loneliness, and she poured all of her light, all of her newfound strength, all of her love into the bond between them, healing the ancient wounds he had carried for so long. This was the true claiming. Not a battle of wills or a clash of power, but a quiet, willing surrender of two souls. His kiss was not the brutal claiming of a king, but the tender worship of a devotee. Their union was a fusion of magic and flesh, a dance of darkness and light. His primal, ancient power, her bright, healing moonstone glow. They swirled together, creating something new, something the world had not seen in millennia. And at the peak of their union, as their souls and bodies finally became one, they both felt it. It was not a physical tremor. It was a ripple in the very fabric of reality. A wave of pure, untamed magic, born of their bond, pulsed outward from the tower. It washed over the city, silent and invisible to humans, but to the supernatural world, it was a cataclysm, a supernova, a declaration. Kaelin held her close, his breath warm against her ear as the last of the tremor faded. "The mating shockwave," he murmured, his voice a mix of awe and grim resolve. "It's a beacon, an announcement, to every supernatural creature, to every ancient enemy of my line, to everyone who has ever hunted for a moonstone wolf. It tells them that we exist." They were healed. They were whole. They were together. But their happy ending was the inciting incident for a much larger, more dangerous story. They were no longer hiding. They were a shining beacon in the darkness. Celeste looked out the window at the glittering city lights, Kaylin's arms a strong, steady circle around her. She was not afraid. She was the Moonstone Queen, and the Obsidian King stood with her. "Let them come," she whispered,